Good morning and welcome to our program today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're delighted today in the context of Martin Luther King Day to have a discussion on what Black America means to Europe. There's been considerable discussion in Europe over the past year as Europeans watch what's happened in the United States in terms of many different events, including the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Protests have erupted across Europe, not only about what was happening in the United States, but interestingly also the situation in many European countries. So with that in mind, we'd like to have a discussion and invite a number of scholars who think about these issues and observe to help us understand what Black America means to Europe. We're joined today by three distinguished scholars. The moderator and facilitator of the conversation today will be Professor Spencer Crew, who is a professor at George Mason University in the Washington area. He was the former interim director of the African American Museum of History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution, and before that, the director of the American History Museum at the Smithsonian. We're joined across the Atlantic by Kehinde Andrews, professor at Birmingham City University, who is a scholar of Black studies, and he has written a number of books on related issues related to racism, grassroots organizations. His last book is entitled Black to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. He's very engaged on these issues in the UK and beyond. And we're also joined by Professor Carey Polk, who's a professor of Black Studies at Amherst College in the United States. He's a cultural historian of the African American diaspora, spends a lot of time in Europe and teaches courses on race, American imagination, and actually Black Europe. And that's an interesting perspective for us today. So you can participate in this conversation as an audience by sending us an email with a comment or question that'll come to us. And you can do that by sending the email to GEP, Global Europe Program, GEP at wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. Again, if you would like to participate, I'll remind you again later, you can send an email to GEP at wilsoncenter.org or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. Without further ado, let me turn to Professor Crew. Spencer, thank you for being with us today, helping us. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Dan. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to be a part of this conversation. We have two, I think, very thoughtful scholars to look at these issues. And I think it's a way for us to look back over 2020, to look at the rise in social activism that was endemic to the United States over that past year, and to think about not only what it meant in terms of reverberations in the United States, but also what it meant to reverberations across the world, and particularly in Europe. So what I'd like to do is to allow each of our scholars to take some time to talk a bit about their perspective on this, and then to engage in a conversation that allow us to go back and forth, and also allow you as the audience to include your thoughts and ideas to be part of this conversation. So what I'd like to do is to begin with Professor Andrews and ask him to give us some perspectives on how he thinks this has affected things in Europe.
Yes, so hi, good morning to you. I guess it's afternoon for me. Thanks for the invitation. It's always good to talk about these issues, and particularly the American connection, because it is very strong in Black diaspora more broadly, and I will unpack why that is briefly. And so what we saw last summer was not really a new thing. So we had the killing of George Floyd, that spread protest around the world. In the UK, we had may have been the biggest protests against anti-racist protests in history, I think they were saying, in terms of the number of people who were around the streets. And you saw a similar thing across Europe. But again, this isn't new. This happened relatively recently. Actually, the book that was referred to, Back to Black, starts with a protest in 2016 in Birmingham. I live in Birmingham, UK, not Alabama, obviously. And that protest was about the killing of Philando Castillo and Alton Sterling. And so this is something which has happened repeatedly. If you go back to the 70s, you'll see a similar thing. There's a real strong connection of the Black diaspora generally. All of us in the UK are relatively recently descended from a migrant from somewhere. My family's Caribbean. You have a lot of family who are people whose family are African migrants. So in Europe, and that kind of is the state of what Black Europe is, where it's much more heavily defined by migration. But that also means that we have a much more international understanding of Blackness. This is one of the criticisms of US Blackness, actually. But it's just you can't have British just makes no sense without looking at the Caribbean, without looking at Africa, without looking at those connections. And a lot of those connections actually go through the United States. So when we see, and there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one of the reasons why America is so dominant is America is dominant just generally, right? Like it is the hegemon, it is the kind of center of the West. More broadly, what happens in America, we were watching the attack on the Capitol building as though it was in London. I mean, just generally, that's how America is more broadly. But for Black America in particular, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is America it provides the kind of extremes that we don't necessarily always see here. So if we think about what America is, that America is essentially Europe on steroids, right? It's millions of Europeans go to a place, a fertile land, which is empty after a genocide, the largest genocide in history, which cleared the land of most of the native population, and then create a country, a country for white people, right? I mean, it literally is the most clear expression of white supremacy you will find because of the roots of what the nation is. And so the kind of being literally no controls on whiteness in the States. So you see this kind of violence from the beginning of the country even to now. And so those extremes of violence, they're not a non-European experience. This is European people who go to America, right? They're very European in their basis. If you think about slavery, if you think about genocide, if you think about colonialism, all of those things are very, very European. The big difference is that Europe has offshored its colonial violence to places like America, to the Caribbean, to Africa, to Asia. And so it's not within the nation state here, right? This is one of the things that Europe tends to think itself as being ahead of America on racial relations issues because we don't have the same level of racial violence. We don't have history of the Ku Klux Klan, although we do have the Ku Klux Klan here, but it's not a big thing. You don't have lynchings, you don't have Jim Crow, those kind of things. So in some ways, America is seen as a bogeyman on racial issues, because it's so obvious, right? Like it's just so obvious. The issue with George Floyd's killing in particular of police violence is, again, this perfect example where you can just see it very, very clearly, but it's an issue that happens here. So if you're Black in Britain, you are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police under suspicious circumstances. The difference is the police don't kill many people in the UK. They don't carry guns. In many European countries, the police aren't armed, routinely, excuse me. And the police don't do that level of violence generally, so we don't get killed as much. Mass incarceration would be another perfect example, where actually the problem is worse proportionally in the UK and large. Well, we actually haven't got statistics for America. Again, one of the reasons why America is quite hegemonic in terms of how we understand race. Most of Europe do not collect statistics on race. So we can't give you any statistics for continental Europe about racial disparities because Britain's kind of the only country that collects these statistics. And when you look at Britain, actually the problem's worse here proportionally than it is in the States. There's not that many Black people in the United Kingdom. We're 3% of the population, but represent 13 or 14% of the prison population. So more overrepresented in the prison population per our numbers than African Americans are. Again, what's the big difference? The UK does not incarcerate anywhere near the amount of people as America. So although proportionally it's worse, in reality it's not worse at all, right? Like we don't have 1 in 3 young Black men in the UK are not going to go to prison. Mass incarceration is not that issue. So you have a state which is the extreme of whiteness, heavily violent, mass incarceration. You can see the issues more clearly, but they are issues that we have here. So that's why we resonate to them. It shouldn't be strange that we do, because it just shows us very clearly what the problem is. The reason for that really is because Europe generally, Britain in particular, Europe generally offshored its colonial violence. It also offshored its Black population as well. So whereas slavery, so in Britain, we don't tend to think about slavery as being foundational to the UK, because slavery was actually illegal within the nation, within the island of England and Scotland and Wales. It was actually illegal. There was famous cases where people were prevented from taking their enslaved back to the Caribbean because on English soil, slavery was illegal, right? So there hasn't been a massive black population here. It's only in the last, really in the last 40, 50 years, say, that there's been anything like a significant population. And even then it's only 3%, whereas America is what, 12%. So you can see that that makes a massive difference, right? Also because of that, it's meant that America's had to deal with the black population for its entire existence. In fact, there's black people in America before most Europeans come to America. So in terms of the nation has to then be openly, overtly racist, the country for white people from its founding, whereas the UK doesn't have to do that because there's all the black people are other places, right? Has a different history. And so you can see the racial politics, therefore, in America very clearly. And you can also see a long history of black activism, mobilization for since certain during slavery, then after slavery. So like we'll tell stories of Harriet Tubman, for instance, is part of our folklore, even though she's American, there's nothing directly to do with us, but that's part of our folklore. We don't have those kind of same correlates in the nation state of the UK. We do, however, have them in and this is one of the big problems when we think about Europe. Europe has its history of itself as being these nation states, so like the United Kingdom, France, Spain, etc. But actually, the history of those countries are really empires. They weren't nation states at all. They were empires. And slavery in the Caribbean, we call it the Caribbean, it was just Europe. It was just different parts of Europe. My family was Jamaican, and Jamaica was a British colony from the 16th century and was ruled by Britain. Part of Britain was Britain. Like it really, really, really was Britain until very recently. Only in 1962, Jamaica got its independence. But because it's offshore, Britain doesn't have to deal with any of those issues, doesn't have to deal with its black population. And when slavery ends, that means that you don't have 3 million people, 3 million enslaved. You don't have millions of enslaved people in the They're not there. They don't have to deal with it. They don't think about it. So that's the reason we don't have Jim Crow. Not because Britain's any more enlightened. It's just simply because all the black people are in the Caribbean. So it wasn't an issue, right? And then whereas in the United States you can see this really, really, really clearly. And because you have Jim Crow, because you have that kind of racial violence to control people, KKK, and because you have the response to that and the activism around that, we rally to that because that's something we can see clearly. And because America obviously is hegemonic, we just see those stories a lot easier. So one of the things I always say is you think about the Caribbean as being like the American South. That is its relationship to Britain. And when we think about America's it's gigantic. It's essentially a continent more than it is a country, in many ways actually. And that migration from the South slaveholding states to the North for African Americans isn't really that much different than the migration from the Caribbean slaveholding states to the mother country. It's just the only reason it takes about essentially a century longer is because of technology, right? You can't just go from like the south to the north is tricky, but doable, right? You could walk if you need to. It's a passable terrain. The Caribbean to England was not doable until 1940. Like it literally was impossible. People would have left in their millions and come to the mother country. They just couldn't do it. And then so once they can do it, you see that the racial formation is exactly the same. Segregation, problems with the police, problems in the schools. It's the same issue, right? And so, but because African Americans have had to articulate that for longer and had to experience that for longer and have the activism around that for far longer, of course we're going to rally to them. Of course there's just a tradition there that we understand. So I always say Malcolm X is my absolute favorite person in history. Academically, intellectually, I basically just copied Malcolm. Like, learn from Malcolm and pass Malcolm's messages on. But you shouldn't really be surprised because actually someone like Malcolm, when I was 16 reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and he was talking directly to my experience because it's a really, really, really similar experience, made more similar by one of the things, and I'll stop on this point, but one of the things that is overlooked often in African American, in Black America, is just kind of have this American exceptionalism, but really Black America is defined by other parts of the diaspora as well, and particularly the Caribbean. So Marcus Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, the Garvey movement more broadly is the most influential movement for Black people, full stop, in the 20th century, and particularly in America. The Garvey movement really shapes many things that come after that. Nation of Islam, some of the tactics, even the civil rights, certainly Black Power, certainly Malcolm X, who's both of his parents were in the Garvey movement. You think about Black Power is so steeped in the Garvey movement. And Garvey's Caribbean, Garvey Jamaican, Garvey is, and there is a really direct link to activism that happens in the UK when we do mobilize here and we do the British Black Power movement in the 60s, 70s. Garvey's like absolutely foundational. But we've kind of, because of this national way we have it thinking about things, we've kind of written Garvey out of British and we've kind of written Garvey out of the America as well. But actually, there's a much stronger connection than you would think, in a much more logical connection through that organization, through the way that we have had to address racism. And there's always been these really deep international connections. So yeah, Black America is like we used to say Harlem was kind of the mecca of the Black world. That was for a reason, and that was a reason that resonated across our experiences, and it was also something that kind of drew us in as a beacon. And that hasn't changed at all. And I think what's happened this summer has shown that relationship is still very, very strong. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Andrews. Professor Polk, would you like to share some thoughts with us, please?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. This is a really great opportunity to talk and to think through these ideas. What's really great in terms of listening to Kehinde's thoughts is that I think a lot about my time in the UK because my father served in the US military. And so I spent 8 years in England as a child. And so my understanding in some ways, before I began to even conceive of something as Black European studies, I began to think a lot about the dialectical relationships that I and my family had with other Black folks that we met both in the United States, but also folks, specifically folks outside of the military gates. And so that's something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of how we understand what Black America means to Europe. And so I wanted to share an archival slice of some of the work that I've recently been working on, thinking about the movement of African American soldiers around the world and how that impacts the notion of what Black America means to Europe. And I'm also hoping that we might also begin to think about the flip side of that, what Europe means to African Americans. And so I want to begin in Berlin in 1946, and then we will move up to the contemporary moment. In September 1946, in Berlin, Germany, the African American writer William Gardner Smith interviewed a striking Black woman, a woman who, quote, seemed out of place among the German blondes, brunettes, and redheads, end quote, frequenting one of the US Army enlisted clubs in the occupied city. Smith served in the US Army as an occupation soldier in post-war Germany. But alongside his everyday military duties, he also worked a side hustle as a special correspondent to the Pittsburgh Courier, the Black newspaper made famous for its promotion of the Double V campaign during the war. And that's victory against fascism abroad and fascism or racism at home. Smith was positively fascinated by the tall and well-dressed Black woman. Here, he wrote, she stood out like an orchid in a field of gardenias. She was something rare, something to be sought after. The woman in question, Madeleine Garber, had been born in Berlin. So the American Negroes want to know about the German Negroes, she said. Very well, I will tell you what I can. Garber worked in the city as an entertainer. In fact, Garber came from a family of performers. Her grandfather immigrated from Togo in the 1890s as a performer in German colonial exhibitions in Berlin. Decades later, during the Nazi regime, she performed in her family trapeze act, the Five Bozambos, and the Deutsche Afrikenschau, an updated human zoo meant to showcase the benevolence of Germany's colonial rule. After surviving World War II, Garber married an African-American soldier during the occupation period, and as soon as she was able, she planned to move with her husband and daughter to live in the United States. Taking a long drag from her cigarette, she told Smith bitterly, "I have learned to hate the Nazis." While Black American GIs routinely described service in Germany as a quote unquote breath of freedom, Garber made the decision, informed by her experience under Nazi rule, that she would rather immigrate to the United States than remain in Berlin. Before the war, Garber estimated there were perhaps 2,000 Afro-Germans in all of Germany, and most were, like herself, entertainers. Quote, "Negroes set the style for clothes in Germany," she said. "Everybody followed their pattern of dress." Because there were so few Blacks in Germany at the time, they lived pretty well. But all of this changed once the Nazi regime came into power. Life became very different, Garber said. Once the Nazis brought their theories of racial superiority, things became bad. We were scorned as semi-apes. We were insulted on the streets. We could not work in factories. Such a thing is crazy, she said. The point of no return for Garber involved one of her girlfriends, also Afro-German, who had been sterilized by the state. Her friend had fallen in love with a white German man, and the couple wanted to marry, but they were denied by Nazi authorities. Then, she said, one day the police came to her house and took the girl to a hospital. She was told by the medical authorities that it was feared she might bear a German child, but the child wouldn't be an Aryan, so they performed an operation on her. Now, she could never have a child. Because Garber's father held French nationality, the American authorities gave her permission to marry an American soldier. "I think I'd like to go to America," she said pensively. And Smith noted in his article about Garber how her eyes lit up. Quote, "After so many years under the Nazis, I think that would be a paradise. From the books I've read and from what I've heard people say, everyone is treated exactly the same there, regardless of race," end quote. And with that statement, William Gardner Smith ended Garber's profile bluntly. "She didn't see me smile," he wrote. While Smith treated her lack of knowledge of American racism with derision and dismissed her dreams of freedom in his own native land forthright, he would interpolate her life story into his novel, Last of the Conquerors, in 1948. The thinly veiled portrait of his experiences as an African-American soldier in a trucking company in occupied Berlin gained him great acclaim, paving the way for his own permanent immigration from the US to France, where he lived for 2 decades before dying in Paris in 1974. And what of the charming yet painfully naive Madeleine Garber, whose experience with fascism in Germany gave her the conviction to expatriate? With the research help of friends and colleagues, Brigitte Rice and Kim Everett, we discovered that Garber did, in fact, immigrate from Germany in 1947 with her daughter, Herdeshon. Garber became a naturalized US citizen, remarried, and lived the rest of her very long life in Buffalo, New York, dying in 2013 at the age of 94. So to return to the question of today's panel, what does Black America mean for Europe today? Well, at the very least, Smith's death in Paris and Garber's in Buffalo necessarily complicate who and what we mean when we speak of Black American in the aggregate, as an imagined community forged in the fire of chattel slavery, and not, for example, through the kiln of colonialism. Perhaps more to the point, however, this question becomes a very different query depending on who we imagine is represented in the political and ideological construction of Europe. And here I would state that to place Black Europeans or Europeans of African descent in the driver's seats of these conversations is a vital political move. As Professor Gary Young rightly pointed out in his essay this summer, and the essay that I referenced to think through my ideas for this talk, I'd like to quote him here. He writes, "The number of Europeans of color, particularly in the cities of Britain, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy has grown considerably. They're either descendants of former colonies, we are here because you were there, or the more recent immigrants who may be asylum seekers, refugees, or economic migrants. These communities too seek to pollinate their own local struggles for racial justice with the more visible interventions taking place in the US," end quote. Professor Young also discusses the fact that well into his 30s, he was far more knowledgeable about the literature and history of Black America than he was about that of Black Britain, where he was born and raised, or indeed of the Caribbean, where his parents are from. Black America, he wrote, has a hegemonic authority in the Black diaspora because, marginalized though it has been within the US, it has a reach that no other Black minority can match, end quote. And this is something that I argue has to change. Even as we attempt to divine the meaning of Black America for Black Europeans, we must foreground the unique struggles of people of African descent who also identify as European. Not only for the struggles of today, but to situate them historically within longer genealogies of political and cultural activism. And this is one of the projects of Black European studies as a field of inquiry more broadly, to displace, but not erase, the US hegemonic hold on notions of race and racialization, and to consider their lessons alongside specific questions of colonialism, ethno-nationalism, migration, and xenophobia. To continue the diachronic project of historical recovery begun by Afro-German feminists with the publication of Barbara Buchanan, Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out, in 1986. To support the political work of ENAR, the European Network Against Racism, who in 2014 crafted a catalog of demands that people of African descent and Black Europeans be recognized as experiencing a specific form of racism across the European Union. To acknowledge the role of activists like Quincy Garriott, whose campaign Zwarte Piet is Racism has been unrelenting in making the Netherlands face the everyday legacy of racism in Dutch society. And to finally take seriously the late Ambelavena Sivanandan's simple yet prescient declaration about British society in the wake of Brexit. Namely that, quote, whatever else Brexit means or does not mean, it certainly means racism. Thank you, and I'll be happy to just be a part of the larger conversation.
Great, thank you very much, each of you. Professor Andrews, I didn't know if you had any thoughts as you listened to Professor Polk, or before I start asking questions.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it really is that kind of historical link is important, and also to the current day. So things like Black Pete, and that's still, I mean, for people who don't know, Black Pete is they literally have blackface. Europe likes blackface. Like it's some places it's not controversial to have blackface. You might be surprised. One of the things also, I think, looking at continental Europe, there is actually quite a big difference, which I guess I've been more aware of recently, between like Britain, which looks more to America, like in terms of, just generally because of language, but really in terms of ideas of race, racial formation, the idea that, again, we count things, we have a census that counts Black people, like, which is very much more leans towards America. Whereas in Europe, it's just not like that at all. Like Europe's like, honestly, Europe is like going back in time. Even for, I say that going back in time for me, when you see some of the things like blackface being perfectly acceptable, the fact they don't really count, they don't have any language. There's no language. Like I was consulting on the European Union did a Black European project, and the only way they could define being Black in Europe was if you had at least a grandparent who came from either the Caribbean or Africa. And so anybody who was like third generation don't count. It literally doesn't count in Europe because they just don't count a race in that same way. So Europe, continental Europe is a different beast in some ways as well.
Yeah. As you both were talking, one of the things that occurred to me is that when the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, grew in the United States, and the impact of George Floyd's death, one of the things they talked about was that probably before the video of Floyd's death, that the greater society didn't recognize the level of violence directed towards the African American community. But that video, that 8 minutes of watching that, sort of awakened in others a sense of what African Americans have been talking about for a long time. Do you think it had a similar impact in Europe, or how do you see that moment of George Floyd's death reverberating, and what meaning did it have there, do you think?
I'll say briefly. I mean, it's been interesting watching this from afar, in a sense, from the United States in Europe, especially given COVID, and it really has seemed to just the idea of us being able to film the police and to have those images circulate within this broader social mediated sphere has made me rethink some of my reservations or frustrations with our new social mediated age, and to really think about the political use value of the new screen world that we're a part of, and so I was shocked to see the mobilizations in cities across Europe, and not just in Europe itself. And so I do believe, it seems as though that at least those moments of protests did spawn a public reaction. My question would be, after the protests, like after the rain, what do we do? And so how much of this is just a moment of a kind of a performance of solidarity, rather than actually getting into the nitty gritty of doing the work in order to really conceive of anti-racist solidarity beyond the performative.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that and say, well, honestly, it's mostly about performance. I think in some ways, I think that generally, because it was so violent, because it was, you saw the whole 8 minutes, it was just essentially undeniable. And once you see it, and once you can see those images, there kind of has to be a response in some cases. One of the reasons why I think it probably struck a chord in Europe is because it wasn't a shooting. Well, Britain, I mean, particularly in Europe, the police don't tend to just go around shooting people. Like it's not even in countries where the police have guns, they don't generally tend to just go around shooting people. So that the kind of choking out, that's something that we do experience. It's something that does happen here. Actually, it is a more kind of European, the way the police kill people. So in some ways, that may have resonated because we have a lot of those stories here, like more than we'd like to admit, and because it is public. And actually, that's one of the reasons why the gender intersection here is really interesting, because Breonna Taylor's killing has, as people say the name, but it didn't spark that same reaction. And a large part of that is because it wasn't visual, right? It wasn't filmed. Right. And generally, the violence against Black women has tended to be behind closed doors, whereas the violence against Black men has tended to be more public. So, it kind of sparks that reaction. And so here, it was in Europe generally, but in UK specifically, there is a big denial of racism. So is it really racist? Is that really racist? And this was something where you could just see, obviously, like, well, of course, like it was so like obvious. And there was a moment where there was a lot of discussion. The conversation changed very dramatically to the point where I was on BBC News, and it was after some of the protests had turned violent, and I was expecting there to be this big thing about violence, and there really wasn't. Everybody's like, oh, we can understand why people are rioting, which is literally here is totally and utterly unheard of. There was a run on black books, so I think in the States it was the same as well, where like just the June was like the biggest selling month for anti-racist books by black authors, with the top of all the bestsellers list. And there was this big wave where it looked like it was a bit different, but then yeah, really quickly went back to normal, like really, really, really quickly. As in before it got to autumn, we were having a debate in the UK about whether, so we have what they call the proms. It's this big thing on BBC where it's classical music, and they always sing this song at the end, Rule Britannia, which is just racist propaganda. Like it literally is a song where the lyrics go, Britain never, never, never will be slaves. Terrible, awful song. They should have dropped that song years ago. But you know, the BBC, maybe now is the time to get rid of it. And there was proper uproar, like really like a massive furore about whether we should get rid of this song. And it just reminded me very quickly that it's all over. It's gone back to where it was before, if I'm honest. And in Europe, there is a really strong desire to kind of keep that history of empire. Brexit just happened, which is essentially about trying to keep that history of empire, etc. So I don't think it's changed too much.
Well, it's interesting. One of the questions we got from the audience, which I think is sort of provocative, is how much of the reaction you see in Europe in terms of demonstrations and things like that are truly sort of Black Lives Matter based, or are they more anti-American based?
I don't think they're anti. I don't know. I don't really think I've seen that much anti-American sentiment, but in some ways they are very anti-American racism based. There is something we saw very clearly where it's like, oh, it's an American issue. Oh yeah, we're gonna, but it's an American issue. It's not really a British issue, and you do see that distinction is really quite clear there. Where I don't think that a lot of the people who protested understood that these are actually, we're not protesting for America. Like when black people come on the street, we're not protesting for America. We're protesting for black people in Europe. And I don't think that was picked up by a lot of people. The other thing I would say is it was nice to have this attention on the issue, but like I said, this isn't new. This happened the other day. Like for us, we get it. Like black people understand. We know violence. We know America. We get it. We'll protest when things happen. The difference here was it was mostly white people in these protests. It was a much bigger event, and I will always be convinced that was solely because it was lockdown and there wasn't really much else happening. So like for one time you had the images of the news were of this, but I think if we were in normal everyday life, I'm very doubtful that it would have had the same impact.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that Black Lives Matter has had an amazing impact on how folks are thinking through at least the media strategies of getting certain stories out, of being able to protest in new ways. But my hope is that we also understand that, this isn't just, add Black Lives Matter from America and stir, right? I think that we have to, really think through the dialectical nature of these moments of exchange. And so thinking about these notions of diaspora as always ongoing, right? As these notions of diaspora help to, in fact, form Black Lives Matter. It's not just that Black Lives Matter sort of arose like Athena, somebody's head, that these folks, they have their own cosmopolitan political consciousness, which was nurtured. And so that's why, I'm a kind of a historian in the sense, and so I always like to ground these ideas into things that happened or before us, that we actually live in the wake of other conscious decisions, depending on how far we want to go back. But I'll say one thing. I mean, I remember whether you understand them as the uprisings or the riots in London 2011. And I remember around 2012, 2013, teaching a class here at Amherst and showing my students images from that. My students' mouths were just open. They could not imagine that this was occurring. And that's that moment where you have to sort of realize that, wow, like my students, as well as myself, we were ensconced, within Obama's second term probably, and so we were just like, wow. I was like, this is the world, and they could not imagine African Americans doing that, right, in 2012, 2013. Again, this is my own private sample, but that alone, at least having my students aware of that, I would argue has an impact upon how they imagine the viability of these forms of protest that continue to go on to this day.
One of the things that we've talked about in the United States, or at least you can begin to see, is that the activism of the summer sort of, people talked about the nation being at a moment of possible change, a moment of possible, I think, new direction for the nation on the issues of race. Do you think that is same sort of impact is flowing across to Europe, or do you think it is, as you say, maybe a momentary burst that'll just go away and things will go back to normal?
I think certainly it's at the moment that people say the same thing. The conversation changed. We had companies here in university. My university had a Black Lives Matter statement. I mean, but believe me, it's just a statement. There's nothing behind it. They haven't changed anything. There's no less racist today than it was before. But so we've had a lot of that. A lot of the football premise of football, soccer, I guess you call it. They're still taking a knee. There's still Black Lives Matter everywhere. But they're still, again, a deeply racist game. In fact, when they had fans, because we haven't had fans at games, right. The one time there were fans at a game, the people were booing the people taking a knee and do the Black Lives Matter protest. So we kind of have these symbolic stuff, but structurally, there has been no change. There's been no policy change. In fact, our government, in America, you're kind of getting a new government which should take you slightly in a better direction, although I'm not the biggest Biden fan, I wouldn't say. In the UK, we're going worse. It's going way worse. Like, we have the most right-wing, reactionary, almost openly racist government we've had, certainly in my lifetime. So no, this, for me, it's a moment that's already passed, and there's actually been a backlash, quite a strong backlash, which is quite pro-empire. Why are we doing all this black stuff? What's the point in this? Yeah. And I would say Britain is always more progressive than most of the rest of Europe on issues of race. So if that's how it is here, I dread to think what it is like on the continent.
I would say I'm not sure. I just it's easy just to sort of I think I spend 70% of my day just shaking my head, right? Because it's just the way of sort of just a shrug and acknowledgement, and that isn't me being hopeless. Right, but it's me really thinking about the accretion of experiences of what Black folks experience, and wondering whether or not these structural forms of racism have any investment in shifting. And that's the moment in which perhaps we may see that in the U.S. Somewhat with a Biden presidency. But again, so much of this is there's so many caveats that you have to place upon that. And that to me is not the same. That is not despondency. That is not hopelessness. But it really is just sort of embracing the truth of what has happened before, and not being content to only try to change the hearts and minds of folks. We really need structural change, and that's what I think that is the impact that we can have if there is an investment in changing the structures, which are deeply racist.
Yeah, I just tag on to that and say that is the problem, is we're still stuck in this idea where racism is about individual people having bad ideas, right? Like, and even this is one of the biggest damage that Trump will do to the discussion of racism is because he's so obviously racist and his policies are obviously terrible, and you have people storm the Capitol. That's the easy way to understand racism. You have these racist people that need to either be removed or educated, and then you kind of solve that's never been what racism's been about. Racism is deeply embedded in the structure of what the society is. So my next book comes out, which I just finished, The New Age of Empire: How Racism and Colonialism Still Rules the World. And just traces it back. This isn't about individuals. This isn't about trying to teach people to be nice. This is about a world which is built on the premise of white supremacy. And if you want to address it, you actually have to address the actual structural issues. And I haven't seen any progress towards that at all, unfortunately.
Well, one of the things it reflects my own lack of knowledge is that what we found here in the United States are the rise of voices that have looked at, as you've said, Professor Andrews, how do you attack the structural issues? Stacey Adams, for example, in Georgia, and figure out, clearly it's a matter of numbers that's important as well, but begun to figure out ways in which you can begin to change things structurally. Have you seen that? Can you share with us any illustrations of that might be occurring across Europe?
No.
No.
I mean, the blunt answer is no. One of the issues and the big problem here is it's just not that many of us. Like really, there really is not that many of us. And so the critical mass to be able to do that. So for instance, in the UK, there is two. So the way our parliament, we have 650 parliamentary seats, which is similar to the House of Representatives. There is only 2 in the whole country that are majority minority, 2 in the whole country. That's heavily because of gerrymandering. So for example, the part of Birmingham I live in is 80% black and brown, yet somehow in the whole of Birmingham, there is not one electoral seat which is predominantly minority, right? And so because of that lack of numbers, we just don't have, it's not possible to have a Stacey Abrams in the UK. And the UK, I can say, is more advanced than most of Europe. So in terms of mainstream politics, it's almost impossible to have that. What we do have, and I don't want to sound despondent, is we do have a long history of Black Power mobilization in the UK with alternate organizations. We had our Saturday school, what we call Saturday schools, different ways of thinking, organizing, addressing issues like homelessness, etc. We do have that. And one of the positive things which is happening after these protests is, I do think there was, because of some of the changes that got made after, we had a Racial Relations Act, we had a more progressive government. I would have said a similar thing in terms of this. People kind of a bit more, are we going in the right direction? I think now what's happened is everybody's realized we're not going in the right direction, and there's a new militancy in the young people. And I think that's where you're going to get the argument for structural change. In Europe, there is basically no chance you're going to get that from mainstream politics.
And I would add, co-sign all that, that one way of, and in some ways, it seems simple, but in, let's say, France, it's not, it's very difficult. But one way of making structural change is that communities of color, using an American model, though there are small numbers, they would like to be able to have statistics that speak to their experiences of discrimination, right? And different nations in Europe will not allow folks to actually accrue these statistics, right? And so you then have a situation where there truly is, there is no representation, right? Statistical or otherwise. And so the idea of activists being able to have statistics that help them understand how many people of color are being hired in certain jobs, are graduating, from the schools, are experiencing forms of police harassment. These things, again, it's a structural change that I think and Enar made this demand in 2014 and saying that this is something that they need, that's a European demand, that Black Europeans need to be able to count themselves in order to make rights claims.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's been interesting here that I think is a reason that's been surprising to some people is that you talk about African Americans, or we might talk about Afro-Europeans, but within that designation, there's a great variety of experiences. And I think one of the things that's appeared here is that how people view racism varies. That African Americans who have this long history of coming out of slavery and being in the United States a long time see race differently than people of African descent who've come to the United States at a later date. And I wonder if you have that same sort of challenge taking place in Europe within the African diaspora on the continent.
Certainly there has been. So generally a lot of the migration issue is often it's a class issue. So there used to be a big distinction. So prior to the 80s, 90s, like Black Britain generally meant Caribbean. So my family's mostly Caribbean. At Birmingham where I live still, is when you say Black people, it's mostly Caribbean people. And then there's a shift where you now there's more people directly from Africa who don't have slavery in their history in the UK now, and in Europe that's the case more broadly. And so what we had growing up was there was this kind of class issue where it tended to be like West African Nigerian migrants, kind of model minority. Something similar is happening in the States with Caribbean. Right. Ironic because Caribbean in the UK are not a model minority, it's like complete opposite. Caribbean in the UK are African Americans essentially, whereas Caribbeans in America are the model minority. So you have, West African migrants who are coming to study, have money. They're not. They're in different economic relations. There was a lot of tension when I was young between African and Caribbean. However, now they're kids of the kids have just been racialized into the same formation as all Black young people. You also have a much more diverse African migration into Europe now, where you don't have the same resources, wealth, etc., etc. And so what we've actually seen now is, particularly in the UK, but again, I think you see this across Europe, is there's a kind of more Black British aesthetic, which isn't dominated by Caribbean. So this most simple way to look at that would be culture, pop culture. We have, I don't know if grime is a big thing. It's in grime's kind of our like hip hop now. And that's dominated by people of direct African descent. Whereas when I was younger, like UK hip hop, you would have no African, there'd be no Africans, all Caribbean people. And so just that shift will show you that there's been a different, there's a different aesthetic now where actually Black British is we're all just experiencing the same thing. That's effective.
Okay. Did you want to add anything?
Props to grime, as a kind of, an indigenous, if we can use that term, creation of Black Britain. And I think that an important one. I was lucky enough to sit on a thesis committee. One of my former students wrote a thesis on grime, and he had spent a year in London and was swept up in the culture, but wanted to understand the political and social constructions of that. And so I learned more about grime, through his work than I learned through my own listening.
Do you see any connections between sort of Black Lives Matters like movements in Europe between the different European countries? As you said, this is a variety of different countries with different experiences. Have you seen any cross-pollination in terms of looking at issues of race and thinking about how to approach that within different societies?
You want to go first, Gary?
Well, the only thing I would say is thinking about the only organization that I know that has attempted to do this, and again, it could be my lack of knowledge, is European Network Against Racism. That they've worked to really talk about Afrophobia in Europe and using that language. And that was something that when I began to try to find more contemporary links of Black European mobilization, their website has been very, very helpful for that. I'll also say that connected to the question of migration has been the refugee movement, right? If we sort of begin to think about the refugee movement rather than the refugee problem, different spaces, especially in Germany, in Berlin, in around 2015, 2016, you really began to see just a really an intersectional approach to the experience of what it meant to be a refugee in ways that I found very hopeful. And so I think that moments like this, they're not necessarily connected. It's that sometimes they occur and then they fade away, and so there's more work I think that we can all do, and to try and to connect these somewhat disparate, sometimes disparate movements together.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, ENA has been really powerful in that, and I spent the last couple of years. I've spent a lot more time in continental Europe. I think there has been an effort to kind of link up some of this. I mean, a lot of this is just language. Like English. Like I'm sure if you ask somebody who was in France or in Germany, they give you much more connection. Because just more broadly, there is far more connection between continental European countries. Because England tends to be quiet. We speak English. We don't learn other languages. And it just properly cuts us off. That's one of the reasons we tend to go more to the States and to Europe. But certainly over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of like Black Studies mobilizations in Europe. And this is one of the areas where social media has helped quite heavily, where there are a lot more connections. And I think those connections are growing because I think people are understanding it's a very similar situation. And in some ways they look, and one of the reasons why continental Europe definitely looks to Britain and America is that issue of there's like literally the language, there is no language to properly discuss race in continent. It doesn't exist in continental Europe. So they're gonna have to come to Britain and America because there's no other the frameworks that really don't exist on the continent. So I think again, and even especially actually with us Britain leaving the EU, make that way worse because actually they're the one country in these discussions saying actually So I think there'll be that will ironically probably lead to more connection between Britain and the rest of Europe because it'll be so necessary to build those links.
I have had at least one more question I want to ask. As you know, we had an event last Wednesday in our capital. Do you see similar kinds of reactions taking place in Europe, or is it a different kind of environment?
Oh no, certainly. We just voted like United Kingdom just voted to leave the European Union, which makes no sense at all. It's just a more civilized version of the capital right. Like really, I mean, it really is. And had Brexit not happened, we probably could very well be seeing that same kind of level of violence. And one of the only real reason that the government conceded to have these referendums because over the last decade, there's been this really resurgent far right nationalism in Europe and in general, but in the UK in particular, really quite violent. We had the assassination of an MP, Joe Cox, during the Brexit campaign. I mean, it was really quite. I actually wonder if Brexit hadn't happened, we would be seeing those forces. But Brexit's kind of allowed taking a relief valve on that. But it'll definitely come back. We're seeing a very similar, and then lots of connections between people here and people in the States as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to support that, I mean, I learned a lot from the work of John Burnett, who wrote a great study, Racial Violence and the Brexit State, came out a couple of years ago, and just talked about how Brexit itself led to the increase of hate crimes against people of color in the UK, right? And in fact, not only sort of, traditionally sort of say like Black people, but, a broad swath, of immigrants. And so, when we see these moments of a kind of nationalist uprising, it's a good moment to take care, and that's what we saw last Wednesday. And really, I would sort of actually probably call it a more correctly ethno-nationalist uprising, and that's something that and the beautiful thing about the concept of ethno-nationalism is that you can use it in America, you can use it in the UK. It actually is very useful concept for us to talk about what it means to include people within the nation state and to exclude others. And I think that that's something that was just on full display last Wednesday. And I think that, for Europeans who sort of, were looking, like, how could this happen, in the U.S., I think it's always very important to look in your backyard as well, and to be aware that these same forces, arguably are part and parcel of nationalism.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right about that. What role does art and culture play in a look at race in Europe in terms of either response or a different way of depicting it?
Certainly, in terms of response, there's been quite a big art and culture has been huge. So, Black Arts Movement in the UK, and again broadly across Europe, was really important culturally. If you think about musical forms, have been massively important. Even when we had, so in the 80s in the UK, we had uprisings around the police, like massive, like much bigger, much more influential than the current uprising they had, like with Brixton was locked up, police couldn't get into Brixton, etc. And culture was massively part of that. I mean, reggae, Rasta was hugely in there as well.
Yeah.
So no, culture's huge part of the mobilizations, and a huge part of the way that we're controlled as well. I mean, that's one thing here, like, not unlike the States where there's been at least some effort to maybe diversify culture in Europe, it's still really white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. It's that is one of the things that's great about social media, is that these ideas, these artistic ideas, are just being transmitted so quickly, and I have faith in the fact that younger generations are much more adept at they have a skill set, and a wherewithal to work within these new mediums in order to spread these ideas far and wide.
This has been terrific. I want to thank you both for your comments and your knowledge on this. I want to make sure if you had any last things you wanted to say, that you had a chance to say that, to share with the audience.
No, just thank you for the opportunity. It was good. I enjoyed the discussion.
Same. It was really great, and I appreciate the Wilson Center for making this conversation possible.
Yeah, I think we all want to thank the Wilson Center and Dan for setting this up and giving us a chance to sort of talk with each other and share our ideas and thoughts and understandings with a larger audience. So let me turn this back to Dan to finish this up.
Well, thank you so much. I learned a whole lot, and I really appreciate your insights. Carrie, I love your story about post-war Berlin. I lived in West Berlin for many years when the wall was there, so that has a particular resonance. Just to finish on the point you made just before, Spencer, it's interesting to me there. What do we notice from the other side of the Atlantic going on, and what sometimes we don't? There was a mass demonstration in Berlin earlier in the last year, not because of the Black Lives Matter this time, but it's more about the vaccine and the vaccine, anti-vaxxers. 20,000 people in front of the German parliament, and they stormed the building, just like in the Capitol. They didn't get in because the guards there stopped them, but they were there on the steps, ready to go. And so that got a little blip of news in the United States, but now everyone's focused. But it's interesting to see, this is not an isolated phenomenon necessarily. Just as the other discussion we've had this whole hour is not an isolated. I've always been struck about the deep transatlantic networks that exist, in which we can learn from each other's experiences. And this is just one more evidence of that deep network, and hopefully we can build on it. So I want to thank the professors, Spencer and Carrie and Kende, for joining us. This will be on our website once the production is finished. We have done this in partners with our colleagues at Black at Wilson, at the Wilson Center, and I want to thank them for helping us put this all together as well. And hopefully we can continue this type of conversation. I think it's a very enriching addition to what is sort of the traditional think tank world. Sometimes don't get into all of these types of things, and maybe we can continue that. So I look forward to being in touch with you all. Thank you to the audience. Spencer, thanks for moderating, and we'll see you all again. Thank you again.